Okay, good morning everyone. So this is basically just a continuation of yesterday's class. So we are going to resume right from where we left off. We were discussing what happens after the party at Elise's house is over. So this is the morning after the party, and the narrator, the author, is ready to leave for her home office, wherever it is. It is somewhere in the countryside. Anyway, she's leaving London and she's going back. And as she's about to step out of the house, she meets this soldier once again, the throwback who had given them cigarettes in the train. So, supposedly, he is here to give something to someone, and he says, well, anyone will do, he said. The thing is, I've got to get back to camp and I'm stuck for fare 8 and 6. So he says he needs money to get back to his camp, right? So this is the same man who would not take money during the train ride when he offered cigarettes to the two women. He refused to take money, but now, right now, he needs money. He wants to get back to his camp. Now consider for a second that this soldier is actually a representative of war itself, right? And one of the things that is essential for warfare to continue is money, right? Without money, nothing will work. Without guns and soldiers and salary for them and training and all these infrastructure, all this economic output, a war would not be possible, right? So here we have the soldier who supposedly represents warfare itself, asking for money from the author. Now, the author, we can take her as an ordinary citizen, and we know that whenever something bad happens, whenever there is a national calamity or a war, it is the ordinary citizen who has to sort of foot the bill, right? They have to find money in order to fund all these things. So that is what is happening here as well. Okay. So the narrator says, I told him I could manage it and was finding the money when he said, putting his parcel on the floor, I don't want to borrow it. I wouldn't think of borrowing it. I've got something for sale. Okay. So this particular soldier, he doesn't just want to take the money without giving something in exchange. He's actually proposing a sale, a business transaction. Okay. So what is that? I said. A funeral, said the soldier. I've got it here. This alarmed me, and I went to the window. No hearse, no coffin stood below. I saw only the avenue of trees. So naturally, when the author hears the term funeral, she looks for all the cultural trappings of a funeral. Funeral is accompanied by a hearse. A hearse is the vehicle in which the coffin is transported. The coffin itself. Then you have all these other things that we associate with funerals, right? People dressed in black, especially in a Western context, and lots of mourning and all kinds of things that are associated with a funeral. But nothing of that sort was here, right? All that she could see was this avenue of trees. So the soldier is explaining this to her, and he says, the soldier smiled. It is an abstract funeral, he explained, opening the parcel. He took it out and I examined it carefully, greatly comforted. It was very much the sort of thing I had wanted. Rather more purple in parts than I would have liked, for I was not in favor of this color of mourning. Still, I thought I could tone it down a bit. So look at what is happening here, something really interesting. This abstract funeral is supposedly something you can see and touch and feel. That is, it is no longer abstract. So this is a kind of a peculiar literary technique that the author is using here. She opts to describe something abstract as if it was something concrete. Okay. So she gives a certain physicality, a certain materiality to this idea that the soldier is proposing to her. And what does she say? She says that this is exactly what she wanted, right? The same thing, this abstract funeral, this is something that she had always thought of getting. The only problem is that it is a little too gaudy, it is a little too extravagant for her, but she can easily adjust, she can tone it down, and she can make it work, right? Okay. Don't worry if it is a little bit confusing. I think it will it will be clearer in a little while more. Okay. So delighted with the bargain, I handed over the 8 shillings and sixpence. There was a great deal of this abstract funeral. Hastily, I packed some of it into the hold-all. Hold-all is her handbag. Some I stuffed in my pockets, and there was still some left over. Elise had returned with a cab, and I hadn't much time, so I ran for it, out of the door and out of the gate of the house of the famous poet, with the rest of my funeral trailing behind me. Okay, so here imagine this funeral as some sort of a, a cloth, right? Something which is long, something which is, flexible, something which you can cram into a handbag or into your pocket, right? So this is what the poet describes it as, some sort of a fabric. And hastily she packed it into her bag, and whatever was left over, she crammed it into her pockets, and she runs out of the house into the cab, which will take her to the railway station. Okay. You will complain that I am withholding evidence. Indeed, you may wonder if there is any evidence at all. An abstract funeral, you will say, is neither here nor there. It is only a notion. You cannot pack a notion into your bag. You cannot see the color of a notion. So here the author is directly addressing us, the readers. And she is telling us that naturally, we as the readers, we would have doubts about what she is describing, right? She is telling us, don't worry about the doubt that we may have. Don't worry about how an abstract funeral can be packed into a bag, or how you can describe this notion, the color of a notion, right? So she's basically telling us to just wait a little bit while, a little bit longer, and it will become clearer. Okay. You will insinuate that what I have just told you is pure fiction. Hear me to the end. I caught the train. Imagine my surprise when I found sitting opposite me my friend the soldier, of whose existence you are so skeptical. Okay. So now we are once more inside the train carriage. The author is there, and surprisingly, we also find the soldier sitting opposite her. Right. So the ending is somewhat mirroring the beginning. Right. This is how the story began, with the author sitting in a train and looking opposite her and seeing the soldier. The same way is how it ends. So we as the readers, we have the right to be skeptical about the existence of this particular soldier, but the author is telling us that, we don't have to be skeptical, right? She will make it clear. All right. As a matter of interest, I said, how would you describe all this funeral you sold me? Describe it, he said. Nobody describes an abstract funeral. You just conceive it. Okay. So nobody can describe an abstract funeral. You just understand it. You just conceive it. Right? The word conceive, it is related to the words conception, which means to give birth, to become pregnant. It also is related to the concept, the word concept, which is an abstract thing, an idea. Right? To conceive means to gather. Gather an idea in your mind, to give birth to an idea, to understand an idea. So nobody can actually describe something which is abstract. They simply understand it, right? So this abstract funeral is also supposed to be understood by the person who buys it. So if you are buying this abstract funeral from the soldier, then you will understand what it is. So let us see what the conversation between the soldier and the author is. There is much in what you say, I replied. Still, describe it I must. because it is not every day one comes by an abstract funeral. I am glad you appreciate that, said the soldier. And after the war, I continued, when I am no longer a civil servant, I hope in a few deftly turned phrases to write of my experiences at the house of the famous poet, which has culminated like this. But of course, I added, I will need to say what it looks like. The soldier did not reply. Okay. So, the reason why the author wants the soldier to describe this abstract funeral is because after the war is over, she plans to write about this whole episode. She plans to, take up a career in writing. And while she writes about this whole experience, she will need to convey what this abstract funeral is to her readers. So that is why she wants this description from the soldier. If it were an okapi or a sea cow, I said, I would have to say what it looked like. No one would believe me otherwise. Okay. So if she were describing something concrete, like a walrus or some sort of sea animal in her story, naturally her readers would want to know what it looks like. So the author has a kind of an obligation to the reader to describe what she is writing about. So that is why she says, I need a description of this this abstract funeral. Do you want your money back? Asked the soldier. Because if so, you can't have it. I spend it on my ticket. Don't misunderstand me, I hasten to say. The funeral is a delightful abstraction. Only I wish to put it down in writing. I felt a great pity for the soldier on seeing his worried look. The ape-like head seemed the saddest thing in the world. I make them by hand, he said, these abstract funerals. A siren sounded somewhere far away. Elise bought one of them last month. She hadn't any complaints. I change at the next stop, he said, getting down his kit from the rack. And what's more, he said, your famous poet brought one. So when the author asked for a description of this abstract funeral, it sort of worried the soldier. The soldier thought, it might not be possible to give her a description, so she might want her money back. But of course, the soldier has already spent this money on his ticket, so there is no point in trying to return it to her because it is not there. So by way of comfort, by way of reassuring the author, the soldier simply says, look, Elise had also purchased an abstract funeral, and so did the famous poet. Okay, so they are all satisfied customers, so you don't have anything to be worried about. Don't worry about this thing that you have purchased. You can just keep it and you can be happy. Okay. All right. And another thing which is really interesting about what he says is, I make them by hand, he said, these abstract funerals. Okay. Okay, so now the author is really interested when she hears that the famous poet has also purchased one of these funerals. Oh, did he? I said. Yes, he said. No complaints. It was just what he wanted, the idea of a funeral. The train pulled up. The soldier leaped down and waved. As the train started again, I unpacked my abstract funeral and looked at it for a few moments. So now the soldier has finally departed. Only the author is left along with her abstract funeral. So she is looking at this abstract funeral. To hell with the idea, I said. It's a real funeral I want. All in good time, said a voice from the corridor. You again? I said. It was the soldier. No, he said. I got off at the last station. I am only a notion of myself. Look here, I said. Would you be offended if I throw all this away? Of course not, said the soldier. You can't offend a notion. I want a real funeral, I explained. One of my own. That's right, said the soldier. And then I'll be able to write about it and go into all the details, I said. Your own funeral, he said. You want to write it up? Yes, I said. But, said he, you're only human. Nobody reports on their own funeral. It's got to be abstract. You see my predicament, I said. I see it, he replied. I get off at this stop. Okay. So here is what happened. After the soldier gets down at a station, the author looks at the abstract funeral once again, and now she decides that she does not want an abstract funeral. So now finally we get an idea about what this is. What is this abstract funeral? Whenever something like war happens, death becomes very common. Death becomes very cheap, right? Uh, Hundreds and thousands of people die. Uh, uh, Buildings are destroyed. The economy is crumbling. Everywhere there's destruction, death, and death becomes something which is accepted as part of the normal, right? So people they reorient their thinking to such a degree that they are no longer surprised by death, right? The same sort of thing happens in the in a pandemic like the one that we are living in, right? We are no longer surprised by the news of 200 people dying every day just in our own state in Kerala, right? um, and in India, if we take the case of the entire nation, maybe 2000 people are dying every day out of this disease, but it doesn't surprise us, right? So in such cases such as these, such as a pandemic or in war, death becomes something which is abstract. Death becomes not a personal thing, right? When we hear about 200 people dying, we don't bother to learn the names of these 200 people. We don't bother to learn their lives, how they lived, what did they achieve in their lives, what did they leave behind, right? We don't know anything about them. These people are just a part of the statistic for the day. So their death has become nothing but an abstraction. It doesn't have any what do you say, any particularity to it, right? It is just an abstract detail. So basically, war sells us these abstract funerals. When our country enters into a war, we all buy this abstract funeral from war itself, from that soldier. We accept the fact that our country might be bombed, our house might be bombed, I might lose my life, anything might happen to me, and after my death, after I die, after my death, it will be reported just as a casualty of war. I'll be just one of the people who died as part of this great destructive act. So that is what the author buys from this soldier, right? Remember that the soldier is a representative of war itself, that ancient, destructive part of what human beings are. And now that she looks at the funeral in a little more detail, she understands that no, I want to write about my own funeral. I want to write about all the particulars that it will have. I want to write about how unique it will be. I don't want to write about a notion. I don't want to write about an abstraction. So she says this to the soldier once again, but not to the real soldier. The real soldier, the very concept of what reality is does not have much importance in this section, but the soldier is supposed to have gotten down at a stop, but still the author is visited by the notion of the soldier, the thought, right? The idea of the soldier. So in her mind, she has this idea of what war is, and it is to that idea that she is saying these things. Okay. All right. So this notion of a soldier alighted. The notion of the soldier also gets down from the train. Once more the train put on speed. Out of the window, I chucked all my 8 and 6 pence worth of abstract funeral. So what does the author do? She just takes this abstract funeral and she flings it out of the window of the train. She gets rid of it. She doesn't want it anymore. Okay. I watched it fluttering over the fields and around the tops of camouflaged factories with the sun glittering richly upon it until it was out of sight. Okay, so the abstract funeral, it spreads across the countryside. It just flies out of the window of the train and it simply spreads and dissipates into the countryside. In other words, the entire countryside is enveloped by abstract funerals. Okay. So now we come to the epilogue of the story, the kind of you know the part after the actual story has come to an end, where the author tells us what happened during that time, during the summer of 1944. In the summer of 1944, a great many people were harshly and suddenly killed. The papers reported in due course those whose names were known to the public. One of these, the famous poet, had returned unexpectedly to his home at Swiss Cottage a few moments before it was hit direct by a flying bomb. Fortunately, he had left his wife and children in the country. So see what happened? The Elise had earlier told the author that the poet will not be returning anytime soon, but unfortunately he unexpectedly returned to his house, and immediately after he returned, the house was bombed by one of these missiles, one of a flying bomb, right? And he was killed. So see what happened to the famous poet. The soldier tells us that the famous poet had purchased one of these abstract funerals, right? And it is what he got. He became a casualty of war. He became just another statistic, just another number that was printed on the newspapers. All right. When I got to the place where my job was, I had some time to spare before going on duty. I decided to ring Elise and thank her properly, as I had left in such a hurry. But the lines were out of order, and the operator could not find words enough to express her annoyance with me. So immediately after getting back to her office, she tried to thank Elise. She tried to call Elise and thank her, but she was not able to get through. What was the reason? Because the house had already been destroyed, right? The house of the famous poet is no longer there. All right. So the telephone operator was really annoyed with the author because she was trying to, get in touch with Elise repeatedly. Behind this overworked, quarrelsome voice from the exchange, I heard the high, long hoot, which means that the telephone at the other end is not functioning, and the sound made me infinitely depressed and weary. It was more intolerable to me than the sirens, and I replaced the receiver. And in fact, Elise had already perished under the house of the famous poet. So just like the poet himself, Elise too had been at the house, and she too had got that abstract funeral, right? She too died. All right. So both of them, both of uh, you know, the inhabitants of that house, the famous poet as well as Elise, both of them have succumbed to death, right? Both of them have accepted that kind of death which they got. But what about the house itself, right? This house was something which moved the author so much, right? Initially, when she came to the house, she was just struck by how how shabby it was, or how without consequence it all was. But then gradually she came to appreciate its uniqueness, right? How it was such a great reflection of the person who was behind it, the great the famous poet. But now that house is also non-existent, right? The house, just the idea, the idea of that, the rooms, the gardens, the books, and all those things which are a part of that house, all of that is now gone, right? So she now remembers that house, the house which does not exist anymore, but which exists only in her mind. The blue cracked bathroom, the bed on the floor, the caked ink bottle, the neglected garden, and the neat rows of books. I try to gather them together in my mind whenever I am enraged by the thought that Elise and the poet were killed outright. The angels of the resurrection will invoke the dead man and the dead woman. But who will care to restore the fallen house of the famous poet, if not myself? Who else will tell its story? So this is what worries her. She believes that if the famous poet and Elise, maybe in the afterlife, if they are believers, if they are Christians, there might be a chance that some time in the afterlife, after the resurrection happens, they might be brought back to life, right? The dead souls might be called back once again, and they might be resurrected. But what about the house itself? Nobody is going to resurrect the house. There is no faith, there is no religion in which inanimate objects will be resurrected. So the only way that house can be brought back to life is through the words that the author herself writes, through the story that the author herself is putting together, right? So she says, who will care to restore the fallen house of the famous poet if not myself? Who else will do it if not her? So this entire project, this entire story becomes a project of the author to restore life to this house, to bring it back to life, to resurrect it once again. When I reflect how Elise and the poet were taken in, how they calmly allowed a well-meaning soldier to sell them the notion of a funeral, I remind myself that one day I will accept, and so will you, an abstract funeral and make no complaints. Okay, so this is how the story ends. And she says, this is the fate that is waiting for you and me also, right? We too will one day accept an abstract funeral. We too will forgo individuality. We too will forgo uniqueness or personality. We will also accept becoming just a statistic, just another casualty of these huge inhuman forces that surround us and control our lives. We become a part of all these things over which we have no control, right? Because that is what happens, that is what happens over the course of life, right? We ultimately, no matter how individualistic you might be, no matter how idealistic you might be, ultimately there comes a time when you have to accept that the world, reality is greater than yourself, and you cannot continuously fight with reality and make yourself exist as an individual human being, right? Ultimately, time and life itself will overtake you. And it is on that note that she ends this story. Okay, so I hope now that we have covered this entire story, um, the key ideas of the story are clear to you. I hope you have understood what an abstract funeral is. I hope you have understood the reason why the author is writing this story about, it is as much about people as it is about that place. You should remember that the title of the story is The House of the Famous Poet, right? It is not the famous poet, or it is not Elise, right? It is the house of the famous poet. So, the importance that a place has in a person's life is also something that we need to think about while we read this story, right? Inanimate things, the objects that we use, the phones, the computers, the laptops, the houses that we live in, all these things too have an impact on what we are, on how we think, right? And sometimes we neglect you know taking into account all these things. Sometimes we don't think that they are important, these things, right? So there is actually a part of literary studies called thing theory, THING, thing theory, where you know uh, all these minor objects that are part of our lives are really scrutinized from a theoretical point of view to understand how they function, how they contribute, um, you know, and become important in our cultural and personal practices. Right. So that is something that you can maybe look at while you are thinking about the story. And yeah, so I think, I will wind up this recording here because it's already around 30 minutes. So if you have any doubt regarding the story, if you still have some clarification that you need about the story, do let me know in the group, and I'll answer your questions. Okay. All right then. See you in the next class.